All right, let's go. Number 10. The first CIA check. In 1972, the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Science and Technology authorized funding for a research program at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. The program was designated SCAN8, an acronym for Scanning by Coordinate. Its purpose was to determine whether human beings could perceive remote locations through non-sensory means by being given nothing more than a set of geographic coordinates. The lead researchers were Harold Puthoff, a physicist and former NSA employee with a top-secret clearance, and Russell Targ, a laser physicist. Both were employed by SRI. Both had conducted prior research into anomalous cognition. The CIA did not approach them speculatively. The agency had been monitoring Soviet research into what Soviet scientists called psychotronics, the study of mind-based phenomena with potential military applications, and had concluded that the question of whether remote perception existed was one that had national security implications, regardless of whether the answer was yes or no. The first significant subject was a New York artist named Ingo Swann. In an initial experiment conducted at the American Society for Psychical Research, Swann was asked to describe the contents of a sealed box suspended from the ceiling of a room he had never entered. He described the contents, a compass and a magnetized rod, with sufficient accuracy to prompt the researchers to document the session formally. The documentation reached Harold Puthoff. Puthoff contacted Swann. Swann traveled to SRI. The CIA contracted SRI for a 6-month preliminary study. The contract value was approximately $50,000. It was the beginning of a program that would run for 23 years, expand across multiple government agencies, involve hundreds of experimental sessions, consume an estimated $20 million in federal funding, and remain classified until 1995. But here is where the SCAN8 contract's significance extends beyond the program it initiated. The CIA did not fund the SRI research because senior officers believed in psychic phenomena. They funded it because the Soviet Union was funding equivalent research and because the question of whether an adversary might develop a human intelligence collection capability with no detectable physical signature, no signal to intercept, no agent to identify, no dead drop to find, was a question the agency could not afford to leave unanswered. The first check was not an endorsement, it was insurance against a possibility that no one wanted to be true and no one could afford to dismiss.
Number 9. Ingo Swann and the Rings of Jupiter. In April 1973, Ingo Swann sat in a monitored laboratory environment at the Stanford Research Institute and was given a single task: describe the planet Jupiter, which Pioneer 10 was then approaching, and which no spacecraft had yet reached closely enough to return detailed imagery. Swann's session notes, which were logged, dated, and retained in the SRI files, described what he perceived as a series of characteristics of Jupiter. Among the descriptions was a notation that the planet appeared to have a ring structure, a band of debris or particulate matter encircling it at some distance from the surface, similar in kind, if not in scale, to the rings of Saturn. Jupiter was not known to have rings. No scientific literature at the time proposed that Jupiter had rings. Pioneer 10, which reached Jupiter in December 1973, did not confirm rings. Its instruments were not positioned or calibrated to detect them. The anomaly in Swann's notes sat in the SRI files, unresolved. In 1979, Voyager 1 passed Jupiter. Its imaging systems captured, for the first time, evidence of a faint ring system encircling the planet. Thin, diffuse, and composed largely of dust-sized particles. The discovery was unexpected. Planetary scientists had not predicted it. The rings of Jupiter were confirmed as real. Swann's session note, predating the discovery by 6 years, was already in a CIA contractor's file. But here is where the Jupiter session's documentary significance becomes more specific than a single anomaly suggests. The SRI researchers had established a protocol for logging sessions before the outcome of any testable element could be known. The Jupiter session was logged before Pioneer 10's encounter. The ring notation was dated before any scientific publication described Jovian rings. The chain of custody on the documentation, CIA contractors' files at a federally funded research institution, was intact when the declassification came 22 years later. The session note does not prove remote viewing works. It is a dated document that describes an accurate feature of a planet before that feature was known to science, produced under monitored conditions at a CIA-funded facility. What it is and what it means are two questions with different answers. The CIA kept the file and kept the funding. Number 8. Pat Price and Semipalatinsk. In 1974, CIA analyst Hal Puthoff provided a remote viewer named Pat Price with a set of geographic coordinates corresponding to a location inside the Soviet Union. Price was given nothing else. He was not told what the coordinates indicated. He was asked to describe what he perceived at the target location. Price was a former Burbank, California police commissioner and city councilman who had come to the SRI program through a referral from Swann. His background was not scientific. His method of describing target locations was conversational. He would speak aloud and the researchers would transcribe. His descriptions of the Semipalatinsk target, which was the Soviet Union's primary nuclear weapons test site in Kazakhstan, included details that the CIA subsequently assessed against satellite imagery and human intelligence on the facility. Price described a large crane structure on a railway track system, a gantry used for positioning test objects, and a multi-story building with a distinctive crane mechanism on the roof. He described the function of the facility as involving large metallic spheres, objects that corresponded to components used in the design and testing of nuclear weapons. The CIA's assessment, produced internally and later partially declassified, noted that several elements of Price's description matched classified overhead imagery of the Semipalatinsk facility at a level of detail that exceeded what could be attributed to prior knowledge, because the coordinates had been provided without identifying context. Price died in 1975. The Semipalatinsk file remained classified for 2 decades. But here is where the Price sessions produced an institutional consequence that outlasted the individual results. The Semipalatinsk assessment was significant, not because any single element of Price's description was irrefutably correct, but because the aggregate of accurate elements exceeded the rate that the CIA's internal analysts, applying conventional probability estimates, could attribute to chance guessing from someone with no prior knowledge of the target. That assessment, produced by the same analytical division that evaluated signal intelligence and satellite imagery, was the document that converted the SCAN8 program into a sustained multi-year research program. The institutional decision to continue was made by people who spent their professional lives evaluating intelligence. They evaluated the Semipalatinsk sessions the same way they evaluated other sources. They continued. Number 7. The missing Soviet bomber. In May 1978, a Soviet T-95 strategic bomber went down over Africa. The crash site was unknown. The Soviets were conducting a recovery operation. The CIA wanted to find the wreckage before the Soviets did, partly for intelligence value and partly to understand what signals equipment and cryptographic material the aircraft might have been carrying. Conventional search methods had produced nothing. The terrain was remote, and the aircraft had gone down in an area where satellite coverage was limited. An analyst within the program submitted the search operation as a remote viewing tasking.
A remote viewer was given the operational requirement without geographic specifics and produced a description that included terrain features, vegetation characteristics, and a general directional bearing from a known reference point. The description was evaluated by analysts who compared it against the available geographic data for the region. The wreckage was subsequently located. The location correlated with the directional bearing and terrain description the viewer had provided. The program's internal after-action documentation noted the correlation. The CIA officer who managed the operational tasking noted it in his session log. The session log was among the documents included in the 1995 declassification package. But here is where the African bomber search changes what the program's defenders and critics were each arguing about. Remote viewing proponents cited the search as evidence of operational utility. The program had contributed to finding something that conventional methods had not found. Skeptics noted that the session description was not precise enough to stand alone as a navigational guide, but it was also not so vague as to be meaningless. It had directional and terrain specificity that analysts had used to narrow the search area. The program's value, its defenders argued, was not replacement of conventional methods, but acceleration of them. The CIA kept funding it.
Number 6. The Tehran Hostages. On November 4, 1979, Iranian students seized the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomatic personnel hostage. The hostages would remain in Iranian custody for 444 days. In the weeks following the seizure, the Carter administration's intelligence apparatus was tasked with everything available to locate the hostages, assess their condition, and support the planning of a rescue operation. Among the methods tasked was remote viewing. Multiple sessions were conducted against the Iranian hostage situation across the period of the crisis. Remote viewers were given operational parameters and asked to describe the locations of specific hostages, the physical conditions of the facilities, and the movement patterns of the captors. The sessions produced descriptions that program personnel evaluated against the limited human intelligence and signals intelligence available on the hostage situation. Some descriptions of physical environments were assessed as partially consistent with what was subsequently known about the conditions inside the embassy compound. The rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, failed in April 1980 at Desert 1 before reaching Tehran due to helicopter mechanical failures and a collision during the abort procedure. The remote viewing sessions were not among the factors cited in the operational failure. But here is where the Tehran tasking reveals something about the program's institutional position within the intelligence community that the individual session results do not. The fact that the CIA tasked remote viewers against the hostage crisis simultaneously with signals intelligence collection, satellite imagery analysis, and human intelligence operations indicates that by 1979, the program had acquired a standing within the operational community, not as a primary source, but as a supplementary one that senior officers were willing to apply to active operations where the cost of trying was low and the cost of missing something was potentially high. It was not used because anyone was certain it worked. It was used because the hostages were real, the intelligence gaps were real, and the program existed.
Number 5. Remote Viewing the KGB. In one of the most operationally audacious sessions documented in the Declassified Stargate files, a remote viewer was tasked with describing the interior of the KGB's Lubyanka headquarters in Moscow, one of the most physically and electronically secured buildings on Earth, and one into which no Western human intelligence source had penetrated at the senior level. The session was conducted in the United States. The viewer was given the coordinates of the Lubyanka building and the operational requirement, described the interior, rooms, functions, personnel locations. The session produced a description of interior spaces, room configurations, and what the viewer characterized as the emotional and operational atmosphere of the facility. The description was logged and evaluated. The CIA had no way to verify the accuracy of the description against ground truth, because no ground truth was available through any confirmed intelligence channel. The session existed in a category that the program's evaluators described as unverifiable, potentially accurate, potentially confabulated, with no independent check available. But here is where the Lubyanka session illustrates the fundamental analytical problem that plagued the program from its first year to its last. The most valuable intelligence targets, Soviet nuclear facilities, KGB operations centers, North Korean command bunkers, were precisely the targets for which no independent verification was available. If a remote viewer described a feature of the Lubyanka interior accurately, there was no confirmed imagery or human product to compare it against. If the description was inaccurate, the same absence of verification meant the inaccuracy could not be confirmed either. The program's value was greatest, in theory, for targets where all other collection methods had failed, but those were exactly the targets where remote viewing results could not be evaluated. The targets where evaluation was possible, open source locations, previously photographed facilities, were targets where remote viewing was least needed. This was a problem the program ever solved. The Lubyanka session file, unverified in either direction, is in the declassified archive.
Number 4. The Army takes over. In 1977, the United States Army began its own parallel program. The CIA's SRI work had been conducted under scientific research parameters. The Army's requirement was operational. Could remote viewing be used to generate actionable intelligence in a military context? The Army program began under the designation Gondola Wish. It evolved through successive redesignations: Grill Flame in 1978, Center Lane in 1983, Sunstreak in 1986, and finally Stargate in 1991. The name under which the entire consolidated program became publicly known after the 1995 declassification. The Army established a unit at Fort Meade, Maryland, staffed by military personnel who were trained as operational remote viewers. They were given the title of Operational Remote Viewers and assigned military intelligence task numbers for their sessions. Their sessions were logged using the same protocols as any intelligence product: source identifier, date, operational requirement, description, analyst evaluation. The training protocol developed at Fort Meade was called Coordinate Remote Viewing, a structured methodology in which the viewer was given geographic coordinates and moved through a defined sequence of perceptual stages, from general impressions to specific details, with each stage logged separately to allow analysts to evaluate which elements were most consistent across multiple sessions on the same target. The most trained and most tested of the Fort Meade viewers was a warrant officer designated Remote Viewer 001. His name was Joseph McMoneagle. But here is where the Army program's existence changes the conventional narrative about Project Stargate. The declassified record is not the story of a CIA curiosity project that was eventually shut down. It is the story of a program that expanded from a single-agency research contract to a multi-agency operational unit staffed by military personnel with security clearances, task numbers, and formal session logs that were processed through the same chain of custody as other intelligence products for nearly 2 decades. The Army did not create a military intelligence unit to pursue a program they considered scientifically frivolous. Whatever the program's results, its institutional expansion was the result of assessments made by people who evaluated intelligence for a living.
Number 3.
Remote Viewer 001. Joseph McMoneagle enlisted in the United States Army in 1964 and served in military intelligence for 2 decades. He was recruited into the Grill Flame program in 1978. Over the following 7 years, he participated in more than 500 monitored remote viewing sessions. He was the most consistently tested operational viewer in the program's history. McMoneagle's sessions were evaluated against available ground truth across multiple operational taskings. The program's internal assessments credited him with an above-chance accuracy rate on verifiable targets. His most documented individual session involved a large enclosed structure at a Soviet military facility in Severodinsk, a facility used for submarine construction and maintenance. His description of the interior of the structure, produced without any identifying information beyond coordinates, was assessed against satellite imagery and signals intelligence on the facility. He described a submarine of unusual dimensions, larger than any Soviet submarine then catalogued in American intelligence databases. He described construction features that suggested a new class of vessel. The session was logged in 1979. In 1980, the Soviet submarine designated Typhoon, the largest submarine ever built, then unknown to Western intelligence in its design specifics, began sea trials. The Typhoon's dimensions and construction features were consistent with elements of McMoneagle's 1979 description. McMoneagle left the Army in 1984. He was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the highest non-combat military decorations for his service in the program. The citation did not specify the nature of that service. It described contributions to national intelligence. But here is where McMoneagle's documented record within the program produces a question that the 1995 declassification did not resolve. The program's critics argued that above-chance accuracy on some targets in some sessions by some viewers was consistent with statistical noise, a result expected by chance across 500 sessions without any genuine perceptual phenomenon. McMoneagle's defenders argued that the pattern of accuracy on specific target types, particularly closed facilities with no available open-source information, exceeded what statistical noise predicted. Both positions were maintained by people with scientific credentials after examining the same data. The Legion of Merit was awarded regardless.
Number 2. Lop Nor and the Chinese nuclear program. Among the operational taskings documented in the Declassified Stargate files is a series of sessions directed against the Chinese nuclear weapons testing facility at Lop Nor, a remote site in Xinjiang province in western China, used for atmospheric and underground nuclear tests from 1964 onward. The sessions were conducted at multiple points across the program's operational years. Remote viewers were tasked with describing the facility's infrastructure, testing schedules, and the characteristics of devices being prepared for detonation. The sessions were evaluated against signals intelligence from test detection systems and satellite-based imagery of the test site. The program's internal evaluations of the Lop Nor sessions produced some of the program's more detailed accuracy assessments. Elements of session descriptions, physical layout of test infrastructure, approximate timing of test activity, characteristics of test devices, were assessed as partially consistent with other intelligence on the facility at rates that program evaluators noted in their documentation. But this is where the Chinese nuclear tasking reveals the program's relationship to the broader intelligence community in a way the SRI laboratory sessions do not. When the program tasked remote viewers against Lop Nor,
the nuclear test monitoring mission was already covered by the most sophisticated technical collection systems in the American intelligence arsenal: AFTAC seismic networks, WC-135 atmospheric collection aircraft, and satellite-based signals and imagery systems that had been refined across 2 decades of Cold War development. Remote viewing was not filling a collection gap on Lop Nur. It was being applied to a target where the results could be checked against other sources, which means it was being used, at least in part, as a validation exercise for the methodology itself. The CIA was checking the program's accuracy where it could be checked, so that when it was applied where it could not be checked, the operators had a documented track record to cite. That is not how fringe programs operate. That is how intelligence programs operate.
Number 1. 12,000 pages. In 1995, the CIA declassified approximately 12,000 pages of documents related to the program then designated Stargate. The declassification was accompanied by the release of an independent assessment commissioned by the American Institutes for Research, a Washington-based research organization, which had been tasked with evaluating the program's scientific validity and operational utility. The AIR assessment was written in 2 parts by 2 researchers with opposing prior positions on the subject. Ray Hyman, a psychologist and prominent scientific skeptic of anomalous cognition research, wrote the critical section. Jessica Utz, a statistician at the University of California at Davis who had previously published peer-reviewed research on remote viewing data, wrote the section evaluating the statistical evidence. Hyman concluded that the program had not produced evidence sufficient to establish remote viewing as a real phenomenon, citing methodological concerns about experimental controls and replication across independent laboratories. Utz concluded that the statistical evidence from the program's research data showed effects significantly above chance across a sufficient number of sessions to constitute evidence that something was occurring that standard probability models could not account for. Her exact language in the report: "The effect has been replicated at a number of laboratories. The statistical results of the studies examined are far beyond what is expected by chance." The CIA released both sections simultaneously. The headline result was that the program was being shut down. The scientific result embedded in the assessment was that the statistical evidence for the phenomenon was, by the assessment of a credentialed statistician reviewing the actual data, compelling. But here is where the 1995 declassification produces its most durable implication. The program ran for 23 years. It consumed $20 million in federal funding. It employed military intelligence officers, was managed by CIA case officers, operated through multiple administrations across party lines, survived multiple internal reviews, and was sustained by the assessments of people who spent their professional lives determining whether intelligence sources were producing reliable information. The 12,000 pages are publicly available. The AIR report is publicly available. The logs, the accuracy assessments, the operational taskings, and the evaluations are in the record. The program is closed. The question it was funded to answer is not. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.